Before we begin, if you enjoy calming, immersive storytelling about history, science, and the mysteries of the world, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really helps us bring you more relaxing content. While you listen, we'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it over there? Leave a comment and let us know. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's journey together into one of the most haunting chapters of modern history, the Chernobyl disaster. On a quiet April night in 1986, in a remote corner of the Soviet Union, the world came perilously close to catastrophe. A routine test at a nuclear power plant spiraled out of control, setting off a chain of events that would scar landscapes, destroy lives, and echo through the corridors of science and politics for generations. This is the story of the Chernobyl disaster, a tale of ambition, secrecy, human error, and resilience. To understand what happened on that fateful night, we must first understand the setting. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was located near the city of Pripyat in the Ukrainian SSR, then part of the Soviet Union. Named after the nearby town of Chernobyl, the plant was a massive complex comprising 4 nuclear reactors, with plans for 2 more. The type of reactor used was the RBMK, a Soviet-designed high-power channel-type reactor. This design was unique to the USSR and had characteristics that, under certain conditions, could make it dangerously unstable. Construction of the plant began in the 1970s, during a time when nuclear power was seen as a symbol of progress and technological mastery. The Soviet Union, eager to demonstrate its industrial strength, heavily promoted nuclear energy. The city of Pripyat, founded in 1970, was built to house the plant's workers and their families. It was a model city, modern, well-equipped, and home to nearly 50,000 residents by the mid-1980s. But behind the facade of modernity were serious problems. The RBMK reactor design had known flaws, most notably a positive void coefficient, which made the reactor more reactive as steam pressure dropped. In simple terms, under specific conditions, the reactor could become more dangerous when it should have been shutting down. These design issues were compounded by a culture of secrecy and denial within the Soviet scientific and political establishment. On the night of April 25, 1986, operators at Reactor 4 began preparing for a safety test. The test was intended to simulate a power outage to ensure that the reactor could safely shut down until backup generators kicked in. This wasn't the first time such a test had been performed. A similar attempt had failed the year before. The goal this time was to demonstrate that the reactor's turbines could produce enough residual power to bridge the 40-50 second gap before emergency generators became operational. As the day wore on, a series of delays pushed the test into the early hours of April 26th. By then, the shift change had brought in a less experienced night crew. Furthermore, in an attempt to stabilize the test conditions, operators disabled several critical safety systems, actions that would later be deemed grossly negligent. By 1:23 a.m., the reactor was in a precarious state. The power level had dropped too low, leading to xenon poisoning, which made the reactor unstable. In response, the operators withdrew almost all of the control rods, devices meant to regulate the reactor's activity. This left the core in an extremely unstable configuration. When the test began, it immediately triggered a rapid power surge. The operators pressed the AZ5 button, a command meant to shut down the reactor completely. But instead of calming the reactor, the flawed RBMK design caused a dramatic spike in reactivity. Within seconds, the core exploded. The initial explosion was followed by a second, even more powerful blast. The force of the explosions blew the 1,000-ton steel and concrete reactor lid into the air, destroyed the reactor building, and exposed the graphite moderator to the atmosphere. This exposed the radioactive core directly to the environment, releasing a massive plume of radioactive material into the night sky. The disaster had begun. In the immediate aftermath, chaos and confusion reigned. Firefighters were dispatched to the site within minutes. None of them were told they were dealing with a nuclear reactor explosion. Most wore only standard firefighting gear, completely inadequate for radioactive exposure. They worked heroically to extinguish the fires burning across the plant, unknowingly stepping through radioactive debris. Many of them would die in the days and weeks to come from acute radiation sickness. Inside the control room, the operators struggled to comprehend what had happened. Instruments were giving conflicting readings. The idea that the reactor had exploded was unthinkable. For years, Soviet nuclear doctrine had insisted that RBMK reactors were inherently safe, so safe, in fact, that a core explosion was considered impossible. This belief delayed a proper response and likely worsened the spread of radiation. It wasn't just the plant workers who were left in the dark. The residents of Pripyat, just a few kilometers away, continued with their lives unaware of the invisible danger seeping into the air. Children went to school, families had picnics, and weddings were held. Meanwhile, radioactive iodine, cesium, and strontium were falling over the city like invisible ash. It wasn't until more than 24 hours later, on April 27th, that the order was given to evacuate Pripyat. Buses were sent in, and residents were told to pack only what they needed for a few days. Most believed they would be returning shortly. They never did. The evacuation was eerily calm. Nearly 50,000 people left behind their homes, pets, and possessions. Their city, once a symbol of Soviet pride, would become a ghost town frozen in time. While Pripyat emptied, the full scale of the disaster was becoming harder to conceal. Radiation levels spiked as far away as Sweden, where scientists detected unusual readings at a nuclear power plant and quickly determined the source must be in the Soviet Union. This forced the USSR to make a public announcement 2 days after the explosion. Even then, the details were vague. It would take weeks, months, and even years for the full story to emerge. In the days immediately following the explosion, the Soviet government mobilized an army of workers, called liquidators, to contain the disaster. These brave individuals included firefighters, soldiers, miners, and scientists. Their tasks were varied and dangerous: clearing radioactive debris, building containment structures, and decontaminating surrounding areas. One of the first steps was to put out the fires and reduce radiation emissions. Helicopters dropped thousands of tons of sand, boron, dolomite, clay, and lead onto the burning reactor core in an attempt to smother the fire and absorb radiation. This approach helped somewhat, but it also had unintended consequences. The intense heat caused some of the materials to vaporize, releasing more radioactive particles into the air. Next came the construction of a containment structure, the sarcophagus, meant to encase the remains of Reactor 4. This effort was a massive undertaking and involved thousands of workers laboring in dangerous conditions. The sarcophagus, completed in late 1986, helped reduce emissions, but was not a permanent solution. Over time, it began to deteriorate, prompting the development of a more durable structure in the 21st century. The immediate effort to stabilize the situation at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was only the beginning of what would become one of the largest and most dangerous cleanup operations in history. As the Soviet government grappled with the magnitude of the disaster, more than 600,000 men and women would eventually be mobilized to participate in the containment and decontamination process. These individuals, referred to collectively as liquidators, perform tasks ranging from highly technical operations in nuclear physics to the most menial and hazardous forms of manual labor. The liquidators came from every corner of the Soviet Union. Many were young soldiers, hastily drafted and given only basic instruction before being sent to the Exclusion Zone. Others were scientists, engineers, miners, and firefighters with specialized knowledge. Some volunteered, spurred by patriotism or a sense of duty. Others were ordered into service. Regardless of background, each of them stepped into an environment where invisible death loomed constantly in the form of radioactive particles. One of the most critical early tasks was to prevent the molten reactor core, now a seething mass of uranium fuel, graphite, and other materials, later dubbed the elephant's foot, from burrowing through the plant's foundation and reaching the groundwater below. If this had occurred, it could have contaminated the Dnieper River, a major water supply for millions of people, including residents of Kyiv. To prevent this catastrophe, Soviet authorities called on a group of coal miners from the Tula and Donetsk regions. These miners were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4. Their goal was to create a chamber where a cooling system could be installed to stabilize the core. Conditions were nightmarish. The temperature in the tunnel reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees, and because of the risk of contaminating their protective suits, many miners worked in little more than their underwear. Despite the dangers, the tunnel was completed in record time. Meanwhile, radiation levels around the plant remained dangerously high, especially on the reactor roof, where chunks of radioactive graphite, ejected during the explosion, posed a grave hazard. Robots were initially deployed to remove the debris, but most malfunctioned due to the intense radiation. It soon became clear that the task would have to be done by humans. Enter the bio-robots. These were men outfitted with crude protective gear, often lead vests and masks, tasked with spending no more than 90 seconds each on the roof. In that brief window, they had to run out, scoop a piece of radioactive debris into a wheelbarrow or over the side, and then retreat. The exposure they received in that short time equaled the maximum allowable dose for a full year. Hundreds of men cycled through this operation, many would suffer health complications in the years to come, though the long-term effects remain difficult to quantify due to limited data and the Soviet policy of secrecy. While efforts continued at the plant, the surrounding area, designated as the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, was evacuated and sealed off. In the weeks following the explosion, over 100,000 people were evacuated from towns and villages across the zone. Eventually, this number would grow to over 350,000. Entire communities were uprooted and resettled, often in hastily constructed apartment blocks elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia, or Belarus. But despite the evacuations, the effects of the disaster were not so easily contained. The radioactive plume released by the explosion did not respect borders. Carried by winds, it drifted across Europe, depositing radioactive isotopes as far away as Sweden, Norway, and the United Kingdom. In some areas, particularly in Belarus and northern Ukraine, contamination levels were severe. Forests, fields, and rivers were tainted with radioactive iodine, cesium, strontium, and plutonium, elements that would linger for decades. The impact on human health became a matter of urgent international concern. In the immediate aftermath, 31 people died as a direct result of the explosion and acute radiation sickness. These included plant workers and first responders. But the long-term health effects were harder to track. Children in the affected regions began to develop unusually high rates of thyroid cancer, particularly linked to iodine-131 exposure. Soviet authorities, having delayed the distribution of stable iodine tablets, left many vulnerable to this radioactive isotope, which concentrates in the thyroid gland. In later years, epidemiologists would link thousands of cases of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents to the Chernobyl fallout. However, assessing the broader toll on human health has proven immensely complicated. Different studies have reached varying conclusions, depending on methodology and political context. The World Health Organization estimated that as many as 4,000 people might eventually die from radiation exposure related to the disaster. Greenpeace and other NGOs place the figure much higher, in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, when accounting for potential cancer deaths over decades. This ambiguity is in part due to the actions of the Soviet government, which, from the outset, sought to control the narrative around Chernobyl. In the days after the explosion, the state media downplayed the severity of the event. The May Day parade in Kyiv, held just 5 days after the disaster, went on as planned, with children and families marching in the streets, even as radioactive dust settled invisibly on the city. Journalists and scientists who raised concerns were often silenced. It was only with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, that a more truthful account began to emerge. Even then, the Soviet Union hesitated to fully disclose the scope of the disaster. By 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed and Ukraine declared independence. Chernobyl, once a symbol of Soviet technological prowess, became a stark reminder of the state's failure to protect its people. The city of Pripyat, now abandoned, remains one of the most haunting places on Earth. Apartment buildings stand frozen in time, with furniture, toys, and clothing still in place. Nature has reclaimed the streets, Trees grow through concrete. Animals roam freely. The Ferris wheel in the city's amusement park, which was scheduled to open for the May Day celebrations, never carried a single passenger. In the years that followed, the Exclusion Zone took on new roles. It became a site of scientific study, a living laboratory, where researchers could study the effects of long-term radiation exposure on ecosystems. Surprisingly, the zone saw a resurgence of wildlife. Wolves, boars, lynx, and even the endangered Przewalski's horse made a return. The absence of human activity created a paradoxical sanctuary, one teeming with life despite the contamination. Back at the power plant, the remaining 3 reactors continued to operate for years after the disaster. Reactor 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991, and Reactor 1 followed in 1996. Reactor 3 remained active until December 2000, when Ukrainian authorities finally shut down the last operating unit, marking the end of nuclear energy production at Chernobyl. But closing the reactors didn't mean the danger was over. The original sarcophagus, hastily constructed in 1986, had begun to crumble. Cracks and leaks threatened to release more radioactive material. In response, an international consortium spearheaded the construction of a new containment structure, the new safe confinement. Completed in 2016, the new safe confinement is a massive steel arch, taller than the Statue of Liberty and wide enough to house the entire Notre Dame Cathedral. It was slid into place over Reactor 4 and the original sarcophagus, designed to last at least 100 years. This modern engineering feat was a collaborative effort involving over 30 countries and symbolized a global commitment to managing the consequences of the disaster. Yet even with this new structure in place, the cleanup is far from over. The interior of Reactor 4 still contains highly radioactive materials, so-called fuel-containing masses, that must eventually be removed and safely stored. This process, expected to take decades, represents one of the greatest nuclear cleanup challenges ever undertaken. Chernobyl also left a profound psychological impact. For many, it shattered their trust in institutions and revealed the fragility of systems they had assumed to be safe. It became a cultural touchstone, a cautionary tale about the limits of human control and the dangers of hubris. In the wake of the disaster, a growing awareness began to develop, not only about the physical consequences of Chernobyl, but also about its political and cultural reverberations. For decades, the Soviet Union had promoted a vision of itself as a flawless superpower, where the hand of science and the state operated in perfect harmony. But Chernobyl revealed cracks in that image. It exposed how systemic secrecy, bureaucratic inertia, and ideological rigidity could turn a manageable emergency into a global crisis. For Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, Chernobyl became a defining event. In later interviews, he would reflect on the disaster as a pivotal moment that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. It eroded the legitimacy of the state, not only in the eyes of the global community, but among its own citizens. People began to question the competency and honesty of their leaders. Glasnost, a policy intended to promote openness and transparency, was no longer just a political philosophy. It became a necessity. In the immediate months following the disaster, the Soviet government created a commission to investigate what had gone wrong. The official narrative blamed the plant operators, citing human error as the primary cause. While it was true that the test had been conducted under extremely unsafe conditions and that safety protocols were ignored, this explanation conveniently overlooked the deeper issue: the inherent design flaws of the RBMK reactor. It wasn't until 1991, 5 years after the disaster and just before the Soviet Union dissolved, that the state admitted the reactor design was fatally flawed. These design flaws included the positive void coefficient and a delayed insertion of the control rods, both of which contributed to the runaway reaction. In hindsight, it became clear that a perfect storm of poor training, faulty technology, and political pressure had converged in the early morning hours of April 26, 1986. One of the most tragic aspects of the Chernobyl disaster was how preventable it could have been. Several years before the accident, Soviet scientists had raised concerns about the RBMK's instability. However, those warnings were buried, dismissed, or classified. Safety culture in the Soviet nuclear industry was minimal at best. Operators were often not informed of a reactor's full capabilities or risks. Training was inconsistent, and transparency was non-existent. In the case of Chernobyl, the operators of Reactor 4 had not been adequately trained to understand the dangers posed by the specific conditions of the test. Furthermore, the safety protocols that were in place were either misunderstood or deliberately circumvented to avoid delaying the test. It was a disaster not only of engineering, but of institutional failure. In the years after the explosion, international pressure forced the Soviet Union, and later, independent Ukraine, to confront the broader implications of the disaster. Worldwide, Chernobyl had already become a symbol of nuclear danger. Anti-nuclear movements gained strength. In countries like Germany, Sweden, and Japan, public opinion shifted dramatically. Nuclear energy, once seen as the future of clean power, now carried the spectre of catastrophe. Internationally, the Chernobyl disaster prompted sweeping changes in nuclear regulation. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, began to implement stricter safety standards. The Convention on Nuclear Safety was adopted in 1994 to ensure greater transparency and cooperation between nations using nuclear power. Many countries re-evaluated their nuclear programs, investing in newer reactor designs with enhanced safety features. Yet even as the world responded with reform, the human costs of Chernobyl continued to unfold. Among the most vulnerable were the children born in the affected regions in the years following the disaster. Many suffered from birth defects, immune disorders, and developmental delays. The true number of health consequences may never be known, due in part to the secrecy of Soviet-era records and the complexity of tracking long-term radiation exposure. For the people of Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, the disaster's legacy became deeply personal. Whole towns and villages, places where generations had lived and worked, became uninhabitable. Families were scattered. Traditions and communities were lost. In some places, life stubbornly returned, with older residents, known as the returnees, illegally moving back to their ancestral homes inside the exclusion zone. These individuals, mostly elderly, preferred to live in familiar surroundings rather than spend their remaining years in unfamiliar apartments far from home. Surprisingly, many of these returnees lived for years, even decades, inside the zone. While the risks of radiation remained, their resilience and independence became a symbol of human endurance. Scientists continue to study this population to understand how low-dose, long-term radiation exposure interacts with health and longevity. The environment inside the exclusion zone also became a subject of intense interest. Early fears suggested that the land would remain barren and lifeless for centuries. Instead, nature adapted in unexpected ways. With human activity largely absent, ecosystems flourished. Forests grew over roads and buildings. Animals once rare in the region, including moose, lynx, and even brown bears, returned. The zone became an accidental wildlife reserve, albeit one shadowed by radioactive contamination. Some scientists observed unusual biological effects, mutations in certain plant and insect species. But the overall picture was more nuanced. While some species struggled, others thrived in the absence of human interference. The exclusion zone today serves as a living experiment in how ecosystems respond to both disaster and recovery. Beyond science, Chernobyl seeped into the collective imagination. It became the subject of books, films, documentaries, and later, a critically acclaimed television series. These cultural interpretations helped bring the disaster's lessons to new generations. They portrayed not only the technical aspects of the meltdown, but the human stories behind it. The firefighters who rushed in without knowing the risks, the engineers who tried desperately to contain the crisis, and the countless families whose lives were changed forever. One of the most haunting figures to emerge from this narrative was Valery Legasov, the deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute and a lead scientist on the commission investigating the accident. Legasov was one of the first Soviet officials to publicly acknowledge the magnitude of the disaster. He pushed for transparency and reforms in nuclear safety, but the political and institutional resistance he faced took a toll. On the second anniversary of the disaster in 1988, Legasov took his own life. His suicide shocked the scientific community and underscored the human cost of silence and repression. His legacy lives on. Portions of his personal tapes, recorded in the days before his death, were later released, revealing the depth of his frustration and the urgency of his warnings. For many, Legasov became a symbol of integrity in a system that had failed to protect its people. As the decades passed, Chernobyl's story evolved. From a tightly controlled secret to a symbol of nuclear recklessness to a cautionary tale about the intersection of science, politics, and ethics. In 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan drew immediate comparisons to Chernobyl. Both involved core meltdowns. Both were precipitated by poor planning and a failure to anticipate worst-case scenarios. Yet there were differences too, most notably the openness of response in Japan compared to the initial cover-up in the Soviet Union. Chernobyl remains the worst nuclear disaster in terms of both cost and consequences, but its legacy is not entirely one of despair. The global nuclear industry is safer today because of the lessons learned from that April night. Emergency protocols are stricter, international cooperation is stronger, and public awareness of nuclear risks is more informed. Still, questions remain. Can nuclear energy ever be made truly safe? What level of risk is acceptable in exchange for clean, carbon-free power? How should we balance technological advancement with environmental and human safety? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions that Chernobyl demands we ask, not just in retrospect, but in every decision we make going forward, about energy, science, governance, and our responsibility to future generations. As the story of Chernobyl unfolded across decades, it evolved from being a single tragic event into a multifaceted symbol of technological fallibility, political secrecy, and human resilience. It influenced how people around the world viewed science and state power, and how nations approached both the risks and responsibilities of nuclear energy. In Ukraine, the memory of Chernobyl became deeply woven into national identity. After gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine faced the enormous burden of managing the legacy of the disaster without the full resources of the superstate that had built the reactor. Chernobyl became both a scar and a catalyst, a painful inheritance, but also a powerful symbol of survival and transformation. In 1997, a significant international agreement helped bring more global resources to the task. The Chernobyl Shelter Fund was established with contributions from countries around the world, and its primary goal was to finance the construction of the new safe confinement. This colossal structure would ultimately slide over the aging sarcophagus of Reactor 4, sealing in radioactive materials and creating a safer environment for decommissioning. Designed to last a century, the new safe confinement became a marvel of international cooperation and engineering. It stands 108 meters tall, 162 meters long, and 257 meters wide, large enough to enclose the Statue of Liberty. Its purpose is not just containment, but facilitation. It allows robotic equipment to begin the long-term process of dismantling the reactor's remains and safely storing the deadly remnants of the explosion. But physical containment wasn't the only kind of healing required. Generations of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians have grown up in the shadow of Chernobyl, many dealing with the trauma, displacement, and fear that followed the disaster. Entire communities were forced to relocate. Many were never fully resettled or integrated into new places. Cultural traditions tied to the land were disrupted. Homes, gardens, ancestral graves, all were left behind. Psychological studies conducted in the years after the disaster noted an increased incidence of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress in affected populations. People who lived near the exclusion zone or who participated in the cleanup efforts often bore not just the physical toll of exposure, but also the emotional weight of uncertainty. Uncertainty about their health, their families, and the long-term future of the places they once called home. In schools across Ukraine and Belarus, the word Chernobyl became shorthand for a lesson in both science and civic awareness. Children learned not only about nuclear energy, but about the dangers of government secrecy, the importance of transparency, and the need for ethical responsibility in positions of power. The disaster had become an enduring curriculum, not just of physics, but of humanity. Ironically, the exclusion zone itself became a site of interest, not just for scientists, but for tourists. Beginning in the early 2000s, guided tours into the zone became increasingly popular. Visitors from around the world came to walk the empty streets of Pripyat, to peer into the decaying schoolhouses and apartments, and to stand at the edge of Reactor 4's sarcophagus. Many described the experience as eerie, even sacred. The zone had a stillness that felt otherworldly, a place where time had stopped, and where the consequences of history remained frozen, in plain sight. Others found it haunting for different reasons. Some saw it as a dark form of disaster tourism, a commodification of tragedy. But even those critics acknowledged that the site's enduring allure said something important about the human desire to witness, to understand, and to remember. Chernobyl also left a cultural legacy far beyond the zone itself. The disaster inspired novels, songs, documentaries, plays, and video games. Each interpretation offered a different lens, some political, some emotional, some speculative, even fantastical. But all of them, in their own way, grappled with the same set of core questions. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? And what can we learn from it? Perhaps no cultural work captured the gravity of Chernobyl more widely than the 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl. Written by Craig Mazin and directed by Johan Renck, the series dramatized the events leading up to and following the disaster with stunning detail and emotional depth. It introduced global audiences to figures like Valery Legasov, Anatoly Dyatlov, and Boris Sherbina, and it starkly depicted the heroism, confusion, and fear that defined those harrowing days. The series also reignited global interest in the true story, prompting renewed discussions about the ethics of nuclear energy, the failures of authoritarian governance, and the need for scientific integrity. It reminded viewers that the lessons of Chernobyl were not limited to one place or time. They remain relevant in every society, in every boardroom where risk is calculated, and in every lab where safety is tested against ambition. As the world increasingly grapples with questions about climate change and sustainable energy, the role of nuclear power remains hotly debated. Advocates argue that modern nuclear reactors, with updated safety measures and passive fail-safes, are essential to reducing carbon emissions. Critics, however, invoke Chernobyl and also Fukushima as reminders that when nuclear systems fail, the consequences can be catastrophic, long-lasting, and global. Chernobyl thus remains a paradox. It represents both the heights of human technological ambition and the depths of human fallibility. It is a symbol of both the incredible power we can harness and the terrible responsibility that power requires. It is a place where silence once reigned, and where the truth, when it finally emerged, reshaped the world. And through it all, it remains quietly in the forests of northern Ukraine, a place where time does not heal in the usual way, where buildings crumble but stories remain, where life adapts, though not without scars, and where the wind, blowing through hollow playgrounds and cracked windows, still carries the faint echoes of what happened on a spring night in 1986. As the years unfolded after the explosion, scientists, doctors, and policymakers continue to study and assess the long-term impacts of the Chernobyl disaster, not just on the immediate environment and health of exposed populations, but also on broader biological, sociological, and economic systems. What emerged was a complex tapestry of effects, some of them predictable, others astonishing. From a biological perspective, Chernobyl provided a grim yet invaluable case study. The surrounding forests, now often referred to as the Red Forest, earned their name from the reddish-brown color the trees turned after absorbing lethal doses of radiation in the days following the explosion. The forest, once vibrant, became a graveyard of flora. Yet within a decade, life began to return. Not just mosses and fungi, but shrubs, small mammals, and bird species. Scientists were startled. The assumption had been that the ecosystem would be sterile for centuries. This return of life prompted a new set of questions. What was the threshold of radiation exposure that nature could withstand? How did certain organisms adapt? And could some species, over time, develop mechanisms to resist or recover from genetic damage caused by radiation? Researchers observed some mutations, especially in insects and birds, changes in coloration, lifespan, and reproductive patterns. Yet many species showed resilience, even thriving in the absence of human disruption. These findings sparked debate within the scientific community. Was nature's apparent recovery a sign of radiation resistance? Or did it simply highlight the profound and often negative impact of human presence? The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone became, in a sense, a massive open-air experiment, an uncontrolled, tragic, yet revealing look at how ecosystems might behave in a post-human world. Parallel to this environmental research, medical studies continued into the human health consequences of the disaster. The most immediate concern remained thyroid cancer, especially in children who'd been exposed to radioactive iodine. In Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, a sharp increase in thyroid cancer cases was documented beginning in the early 1990s. This was one of the few effects directly and conclusively linked to the disaster. The radioactive isotope iodine-131 has a short half-life, just 8 days, but it is quickly absorbed by the thyroid gland, especially in children, and can wreak havoc on developing tissues. Beyond this, the data became more ambiguous. Some studies suggested increases in other types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and immune disorders. Others pointed out that psychological stress, economic hardship, and displacement could also be major contributing factors. The term radiophobia entered the lexicon, referring not to irrational fear, but to the very real psychological burden of living with invisible danger. For the liquidators, the hundreds of thousands of men and women who had participated in cleanup efforts, health outcomes were equally mixed. Some suffered severe radiation sickness, cancer, and other long-term effects. Others reported fewer problems than expected. Part of the difficulty lay in record keeping. During the Soviet era, many medical reports were incomplete, altered, or classified. And as years passed, distinguishing between radiation-induced illness and natural causes became increasingly difficult. Yet, these uncertainties did not diminish the suffering of those who believed, with good reason, that their health had been compromised. Advocacy groups formed across Ukraine and Belarus, pushing for better medical care, recognition, and compensation. Memorials were erected in Kyiv, Minsk, and other cities, somber reminders of the invisible sacrifices made by thousands. Beyond the health impacts, the economic consequences of the disaster were immense. Vast tracts of land were rendered unusable for agriculture or habitation. livestock were slaughtered en masse. Farms, factories, and entire communities were abandoned. In Belarus alone, nearly a quarter of its territory was contaminated to some degree, causing massive disruption to food production and rural economies. The cost of cleanup, relocation, and long-term healthcare stretched the resources of the newly independent states that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, in particular, bore a heavy burden. In the 1990s, it was estimated that up to 5% of the country's national budget was spent dealing with the consequences of Chernobyl. International aid helped, but the scope of the disaster far exceeded initial projections. In the midst of these challenges, some people began to return, not officially, but quietly, and against the advice of authorities. These self-settlers, mostly elderly residents of villages within the exclusion zone, had fled after the explosion, but later came back to their homes. For them, the fear of radiation was outweighed by the pain of displacement. They wanted to die on their own land, near their family graves, among familiar woods and fields. Anthropologists and journalists who visited these communities found a unique form of resilience. The self-settlers grew their own food, drank well water, and lived with minimal outside support. Radiation levels remained elevated, but not uniformly so. Some areas were surprisingly clean, while others remained dangerously hot. These people, often in their 70s or 80s, became symbols of defiance, survival, and the complexity of post-disaster life. Chernobyl had created not just a radioactive wasteland, but a space filled with paradoxes, danger and sanctuary, abandonment and return, decay and growth. It was a place frozen in time and yet constantly evolving. It was a landscape where the past, present, and future all seemed to blur together. And as the 21st century progressed, the world returned its gaze to the zone with renewed interest. Scientists set up monitoring stations. Artists created installations among the ruins. Filmmakers documented the eerie silence of Pripyat's abandoned amusement park. Students, thrill seekers, and activists all found meaning in the shadows of Reactor 4. In 2016, when the new safe confinement was finally moved into place, it felt like a new chapter had begun. The giant arch of steel and engineering brilliance stood as a shield, both literal and symbolic, against the mistakes of the past. Underneath it, the shattered remains of the reactor lay dormant, watched by cameras, sensors, and the world. But the work was not over. Removing the fuel-containing materials, decontaminating the surrounding soil, and safely managing radioactive waste would require not years, but generations. Scientists estimate that parts of the exclusion zone will remain hazardous for up to 20,000 years. In a way, Chernobyl is no longer just a disaster. It is a legacy. It is a story that continues to unfold, not only in Ukraine and Belarus, but in classrooms, laboratories, and policy debates around the globe. It is a reminder of the immense power we wield and the immense care it demands. As international interest in the Chernobyl site grew, so too did its complexity as a cultural and historical symbol. It was no longer just a ruined power plant, nor merely a cautionary tale of Soviet-era failure. Instead, Chernobyl began to transform into a mirror, reflecting our hopes, fears, and evolving relationship with the technologies we create and the risks we take. The very landscape of the exclusion zone began to carry layered meanings. For some, it was a reminder of authoritarian secrecy and the hubris of unchecked power. For others, it was a place of ecological mystery and unexpected rebirth. And for the descendants of evacuees, it became a quiet, unhealed wound, an ancestral home forever closed off, suspended in radioactive stasis. Over time, the exclusion zone attracted an unlikely community. Scientists, journalists, ecologists, and cultural historians who made repeated visits or even long-term installations inside its perimeter. Researchers from across the globe collaborated with Ukrainian institutions to monitor radiation levels, assess ecological dynamics, and track the slow decay of man-made structures. One of the most surprising discoveries was the degree to which nature had flourished in the absence of human activity. This gave rise to an often debated theory. Was Chernobyl actually a kind of accidental rewilding? Could the absence of human development create, even in irradiated soil, a thriving refuge for flora and fauna? The return of the Przewalski's horse, once near extinction, sparked hope among conservationists. Packs of wolves, herds of deer, and even bears were observed roaming freely. Birds nested in crumbling buildings. Beavers rebuilt dams in polluted streams. Though radiation continued to leave subtle marks, shortened lifespans in some species, altered breeding patterns in others, the region was, paradoxically, alive. These paradoxes turned the zone into a philosophical riddle as well as a scientific one. Could it be that human activity, even when absent for tragic reasons, was more damaging to ecosystems than radiation itself? What did it mean that animals could adapt where people could not? Could Chernobyl be seen not just as a warning, but as an invitation to reconsider how we live with the planet? Amid these questions, the site began to attract artists, poets, and photographers. Some came to document the decay, capturing images of rusting tricycles, cracked windows, and faded murals of Soviet astronauts. Others saw Chernobyl as a space for reflection, a place to meditate on loss, history, and human fragility. In this sense, the site became almost sacred, not religious, perhaps, but sacred in the sense that it embodied an emotional weight that defied simple categorization. This emotional resonance intensified with the release of the 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl, which dramatized the events leading up to and following the explosion. The series received critical acclaim for its haunting realism, human storytelling, and moral depth. It introduced millions to the bravery of scientists like Valery Legasov and Boris Sherbina, and to the ordinary workers and citizens caught in the storm of misinformation and catastrophe. The impact of the series was immediate. Tourism to the exclusion zones surged. Book sales on the disaster spiked. Documentaries and podcasts revisited the story. And perhaps most importantly, the show reignited global dialogue about nuclear safety, state responsibility, and the tension between truth and power. The lessons of Chernobyl were not relegated to the past. In March 2011, the earthquake and tsunami that triggered the meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in Japan once again brought the spectre of nuclear disaster into public view. as images of reactors venting radioactive steam and citizens fleeing radiation zones flooded the media, many were reminded of Pripyat. The comparisons were inevitable and instructive. Fukushima and Chernobyl differed in important ways. The Japanese government, while criticized for its early handling of the crisis, was far more transparent than the Soviet authorities had been in 1986. Emergency evacuations were more timely. The reactors had different designs and failure modes, yet the core issue, an overconfidence in technology, combined with an underestimation of risk, resonated in both events. For some, Fukushima reaffirmed fears that nuclear energy could never be made entirely safe. For others, it was a reminder that disaster is not inherent to nuclear technology, but to human decision-making under pressure. In both cases, the margin for error had proven dangerously thin. These debates extended far beyond engineering circles. In parliaments, universities, and households, people reconsidered the role of nuclear energy in a world increasingly threatened by climate change. Could we afford to abandon nuclear power when carbon emissions from fossil fuels were pushing the planet toward ecological collapse? Could safer reactor designs and stricter oversight restore public trust? These were, and remain, deeply consequential questions. And at their heart lay the haunting memory of a reactor in Ukraine, now silent, buried under layers of steel and concrete, but far from forgotten. As of today, efforts continue to decommission the remaining elements of the Chernobyl plant. Waste storage, site monitoring, and environmental cleanup are ongoing. The Ukrainian government, in cooperation with international agencies, has committed to making the exclusion zone safer and more stable for the long term. But the challenges remain formidable. Radiation, though invisible, does not disappear easily. Some isotopes, like cesium-137, will linger for hundreds of years. Others, like plutonium-239, could remain hazardous for thousands. The very soil in some areas still glows faintly on Geiger counters, and pockets of intense contamination, known as hotspots, continue to pose risks to anyone who lingers too long. And yet, the human connection to this land has not been severed. Families of evacuees still make pilgrimages to their old homes. Scientists walk carefully through the forests, measuring background levels. Documentarians shoot footage of foxes stalking through the ruins of schools. Life, curious, mournful, adaptive, goes on. In this way, Chernobyl has become something more than a disaster site. It is a reflection of who we are, what we are capable of, and how we respond when things go terribly wrong. It is a reminder that the consequences of our actions can echo far beyond our intentions, and that our resilience, like our ambition, is boundless. As time moved forward and the radioactive dust settled, both literally and figuratively, the legacy of Chernobyl entered a new phase. No longer simply a story of catastrophe, it began to evolve into a study in long-term resilience, governance, and the enduring complexity of nuclear energy policy across the globe. The 21st century brought renewed attention to the lessons Chernobyl had to offer. Governments and agencies worldwide began to re-evaluate their emergency preparedness, their communication protocols, and most significantly, their infrastructure. In nuclear plants across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, Engineers and policymakers asked themselves a sobering question. If this happened here, how would we respond? This question was not hypothetical. Nuclear energy, though controversial, remains an integral part of the global power landscape. As climate change drives a growing urgency to reduce carbon emissions, nuclear power is once again at the center of energy debates. Unlike coal or oil, nuclear power produces virtually no greenhouse gases during operation. For some countries, like France, Sweden, and South Korea, it accounts for a significant percentage of national energy production. Yet the spectre of Chernobyl looms. The core dilemma is this. While nuclear power is clean and efficient in terms of emissions, its failures are uniquely catastrophic. No other form of energy carries the potential to render entire cities uninhabitable or poison ecosystems for millennia. The trade-offs are immense, and the margin for error unforgiving. In the wake of Chernobyl, new reactor designs have emerged, so-called Generation 3 and Generation 4 nuclear reactors that aim to be safer, more efficient, and more resistant to meltdowns. Many include passive safety systems that require no human intervention or external power to shut down in the event of an emergency. Some even use different materials for fuel and cooling, reducing the risk of catastrophic reactions. But these designs are expensive and politically contentious. In some countries, public opinion remains firmly against nuclear power of any kind. Germany, for example, decided to phase out all nuclear power following the Fukushima disaster in 2011, aiming instead to rely on renewables like solar and wind. In contrast, countries like China and India are expanding their nuclear programs, seeing it as a critical component of their long-term energy security. Chernobyl's influence also lives on in international law. The disaster spurred the creation of new treaties and protocols governing nuclear safety and emergency response. The Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Assistance in the case of a nuclear accident or radiological emergency were both adopted by the International Atomic Energy Agency in the wake of the disaster. These agreements aim to ensure that if another Chernobyl were ever to occur, the global community would be informed quickly and could respond collaboratively. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, the story of Chernobyl remains ever present. The country has embraced the disaster as both a symbol of national suffering and a catalyst for sovereignty. After all, it was within the borders of Ukraine, not Moscow, that the explosion occurred. And it has been Ukraine, not Russia, that has borne the primary responsibility for its legacy. Ukrainian scientists, engineers, and administrators have managed the site for decades, often with limited resources and under the shadow of geopolitical instability. In 2014, when conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine and Russia annexed Crimea, fears briefly resurfaced about the safety of nuclear facilities. Would the Chernobyl site be targeted or compromised? Could war create new risks for radiation release? Fortunately, the zone remained secure. But the incident underscored the fragile interconnectedness of energy, security, and sovereignty in a post-Chernobyl world. Despite these challenges, Ukraine has taken steps to reclaim the exclusion zone, not as a residential area, but as a symbol of progress. In 2018, a solar power plant was built near the ruins of the reactor. Covering an area the size of 2 football fields, it generates enough electricity to power a small town. The idea is deeply symbolic, turning a site of energy failure into one of renewable promise. Elsewhere in the zone, research centers have been established to monitor wildlife, study radiation's long-term effects, and test experimental decontamination techniques. These include phytoremediation, using certain plants to extract radioactive elements from the soil, and new concrete and polymer barriers to contain contaminated groundwater. It's slow, often painstaking work, but it's progress. For many Ukrainians, especially those too young to remember the explosion, the zone has become part of a broader conversation about national identity, ecological responsibility, and historical memory. Schools teach the disaster not just as a scientific event, but as a civic one. Museums display artifacts from Pripyat. Annual commemorations mark April 26th as a day of mourning, reflection, and resilience. Outside of Ukraine, Chernobyl continues to cast its long shadow. The word itself has become shorthand, not just for disaster, but for any situation where hidden flaws, ignored warnings, and institutional arrogance combine to create catastrophe. In boardrooms, in government reports, and even in fiction, a Chernobyl is often invoked as the worst-case scenario, the one outcome that must be avoided at all costs. And yet, this narrative is incomplete. Because Chernobyl is not just about failure, it's also about response. About how ordinary people, scientists, soldiers, mothers, and miners stepped up in the face of unimaginable danger. It's about how a nation, fractured and reeling, began the slow process of accountability and recovery. It's about how a quiet forest, contaminated by radiation, became a paradoxical refuge for wildlife and wonder. Chernobyl is, in its own way, a story of paradox. It is the story of a place destroyed and then partially reclaimed, of a disaster caused by secrecy and then answered with science, of technology's failure and nature's quiet resilience. And above all, it is a reminder that the legacies we inherit are not always the ones we choose, but we are still responsible for how we carry them forward. The psychological legacy of Chernobyl is perhaps one of its most profound and least understood dimensions. While the world often measures disasters by casualties, economic damage, or contamination levels, the invisible burden borne by the human mind is harder to quantify. In the wake of the explosion, millions of people across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia live not only with the physical risk of radiation exposure, but with persistent uncertainty, fear, and loss. For many, Chernobyl shattered a foundational belief that the state would protect its citizens. The initial secrecy surrounding the explosion, the delayed evacuations, and the silencing of scientists and journalists eroded trust in institutions. This distrust became generational. Children born after 1986 often grew up with parents or grandparents who carried deep skepticism toward official narratives, not just about nuclear safety, but about medicine, governance, and truth itself. The psychological toll was especially severe among evacuees and liquidators. Displaced from their homes, often separated from extended family and communities, many struggled with identity, depression, and anxiety. Studies conducted in the 1990s and 2000s revealed elevated rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, substance abuse, and feelings of hopelessness among these populations. The trauma was compounded by the intangible nature of radiation. Unlike a natural disaster that leaves visible destruction, radiation is silent and invisible, creating a constant sense of unseen threat. One of the more subtle but damaging effects was what psychologists termed learned helplessness. For many residents of contaminated areas, especially in rural Belarus, there was little they could do to protect themselves or their children. The contaminated food, water, and soil created a persistent sense of vulnerability. Over time, this led to apathy, withdrawal from civic engagement, and in some cases, resignation to poor health outcomes. Yet, even in these circumstances, resilience found its way through. Community support groups formed. Non-governmental organizations stepped in to provide medical assistance, counseling, and education. Mothers advocated for health screenings and iodine distribution. Teachers adapted curricula to include radiation safety. Across the affected regions, individuals turned to one another to fill the void left by state failure. The psychological legacy also extended to how societies remembered, or chose to forget, the disaster. In the early post-Soviet years, the trauma of Chernobyl was sometimes buried beneath the more immediate economic and political upheavals. As Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia transitioned through independence, hyperinflation, and new governance models, public memory of the disaster became fragmented. For some, it was a rallying point, a symbol of the people's endurance. For others, it remained a source of shame or guilt, particularly among officials who had participated in the cover-up or the delayed response. For many more, it was simply too painful to revisit. Over time, however, remembrance took firmer root. In Ukraine, annual commemorations began to include not just official ceremonies, but public art, concerts, and student-led events. In Belarus, a country that suffered extensive contamination but received far less international attention, local communities began organizing memorials to honor the dead and displaced. In Russia, the narrative became more complex, both acknowledging the heroism of the liquidators and occasionally downplaying the structural causes of the disaster. The Chernobyl Museum in Kyiv stands as one of the most comprehensive tributes to the event's legacy. Opened in 1992, the museum contains artifacts, photographs, documents, and personal accounts from those who lived through the disaster. Its exhibits are emotionally powerful: an abandoned classroom, a firefighter's scorched uniform, a wall of portraits memorializing those who died. It also offers interactive displays and educational programs, ensuring that new generations understand the human and scientific dimensions of the event. The museum, like the site itself, is a place of duality, a place of mourning, but also of learning, of tragedy and transformation. And as visitors walk through its corridors, they often report a quiet sense of awe, not just at what happened, but at how much was risked, endured, and ultimately saved. One striking aspect of Chernobyl's continued presence in public consciousness is how it transcends borders. People around the world who had never heard of Pripyat or the RBMK reactor became invested in the story. The disaster inspired countless personal reflections, blog posts, poems, essays, and oral histories. In the United States, some school science programs include Chernobyl in their curriculum when teaching about nuclear energy. In Japan, particularly after Fukushima, the two disasters are often compared and analyzed together. In France and Germany, the anti-nuclear movements of the late 20th century trace some of their growth directly to the fears sparked by Chernobyl. And online, across forums, social media, and digital archives, the story continues to be retold. The accessibility of satellite imagery, drone footage, and documentary film has turned the Exclusion Zone into a kind of digital pilgrimage site. For many, it's a place they may never physically visit, but which still resonates deeply with their own sense of vulnerability and hope. Among the most enduring elements of the Chernobyl story is the question of silence. The silence that followed the explosion. The silence of officials who knew more than they said. The silence in the forests where people once lived. And the silence that lingers in the zone itself, broken only by the rustle of wind through hollow buildings and the occasional chirp of a Geiger counter. Yet silence, paradoxically, has also allowed reflection. In that stillness, people have written, remembered, and rebuilt. The quiet has given space for voices to emerge, voices like that of Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian Nobel laureate who chronicled the disaster through the testimonies of ordinary people. Her book, Voices from Chernobyl, remains one of the most powerful and human accounts of what the disaster meant, not to governments or institutions, but to families, children, and communities. Her writing, like the site itself, reminds us that Chernobyl was not just a technological failure, it was a human one. And, equally, that the response, the endurance, and the acts of kindness in its aftermath were also deeply human. In the 3 decades following the disaster, as layers of contamination, memory, and meaning accumulated around Chernobyl, a quieter, subtler transformation was also taking place. The reimagining of the zone as a living archive. The exclusion zone, once defined by silence and decay, slowly became a place of scientific discovery, education, and even artistic creation. It was no longer merely the site of a tragedy. It had become a place where the past, present, and future continuously intersected. One of the most remarkable aspects of the zone's evolution has been its transformation into a site for long-term environmental monitoring. Because it encompasses a variety of biomes, forests, wetlands, rivers, and urban ruins, it provides scientists with a unique opportunity to study how ecosystems adapt to chronic radiation exposure over extended periods. These observations have produced surprising and sometimes counterintuitive results. In areas of high contamination, plant life has demonstrated both resilience and subtle mutations. Trees continue to grow, though often with unusual forms. Certain species of fungi, such as Cryptococcus neoformans, have even been found to metabolize radiation, converting it into chemical energy, a process akin to photosynthesis, known as radiosynthesis. These organisms thrive in environments most would consider lethal, raising intriguing possibilities for biotechnology and radiation-resistant life forms. Animal populations, too, have rebounded in unexpected ways. The absence of humans has allowed many species to flourish without interference. The zone now boasts a growing number of wild boars, deer, foxes, lynx, and birds of prey. Even packs of wolves have returned, establishing stable territories. While these animals live with elevated levels of radioactive isotopes in their bodies, many appear to lead otherwise normal lives. The implications for our understanding of radiation's impact on complex organisms are vast and still unfolding. The zone has also become a site for testing decontamination methods. Researchers have experimented with different strategies for containing or reducing radiation in soil and water. Some approaches involve chemical binding agents that trap isotopes, preventing them from leaching into groundwater. Others focus on the use of hyperaccumulator plants that can extract cesium or strontium from the earth. These experiments are slow and often yield partial results, but they reflect a global effort to turn Chernobyl into a place not just of mourning, but of learning. The site is now a nexus for international collaboration. Scientists from Ukraine, Germany, Japan, the United States, and beyond all contribute to ongoing studies, comparing notes, testing hypotheses, and sharing insights that could inform future responses to nuclear accidents. Parallel to the scientific work, the zone has seen a growing influx of artists and educators. Painters, writers, photographers, and filmmakers have turned to Chernobyl not merely as a backdrop, but as a subject in its own right. The juxtaposition of rusted Ferris wheels and overgrown apartment blocks has come to symbolize the fragility of human achievement. Nature's return amidst human absence offers a poignant contrast: beauty amid ruin, growth amid contamination. Some of the most compelling art to emerge from Chernobyl has come from those with direct ties to the disaster, survivors, evacuees, and descendants who channel personal history into creative expression. Their works capture not only the horror of 1986, but the deep emotional and psychological currents that flowed through the decades that followed. Themes of loss, resilience, and existential reckoning recur across genres and mediums. Education, too, has flourished. Ukrainian universities have incorporated Chernobyl studies into programs ranging from environmental science to public health and ethics. International universities offer study abroad opportunities to visit the zone, participate in research, and reflect on its broader implications. The story of Chernobyl has become a multidisciplinary case study, touching on biology, engineering, politics, communication, and psychology. Even the Ukrainian government has embraced the zone's educational potential. In 2019, Chernobyl was declared an official tourist site, with infrastructure improvements to support guided tours. These tours are carefully regulated to ensure safety, and they often include visits to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the ghost city of Pripyat, the Red Forest, and key memorials. Tourism in the zone has been a subject of debate. Critics argue that it risks trivializing tragedy or turning disaster into spectacle. Others contend that it serves a crucial function, keeping memory alive, fostering global awareness, and generating revenue to support preservation and research. Visitors who take part in respectful, informed tours often leave with a deeper understanding of nuclear energy, human vulnerability, and the costs of secrecy. The Exclusion Zone is now home to a small number of staff and researchers who work in rotational shifts. Facilities have been built to accommodate them, including dormitories, labs, and communication hubs. While it is not a place for permanent residence, it is a place of work, exploration, and observation. One cannot ignore the symbolic power of this transformation. Where once there was only fear, there is now inquiry. Where silence reigned, dialogue has returned. The same land that once threatened to spread invisible death now hosts the hum of Geiger counters, the rustle of field notebooks, and the click of camera shutters. The zone has become a reminder not only of what went wrong, but of what is possible when a society refuses to let trauma calcify into silence. It stands as proof that memory and progress are not mutually exclusive, that we can study the past not to relive it, but to outgrow it. Yet, amid all this, the zone remains an unsettled place. Not quite alive, but not dead. Not fully safe, but not untouchable. It occupies a liminal space, both geographically and metaphorically, a threshold between destruction and recovery. This ambiguity is part of its power. Chernobyl resists neat conclusions. It is not simply a cautionary tale or a triumph of science. It is both and more. It is a story that continues to evolve with every passing year, with every study published, with every visitor who walks through Pripyat's silent streets and listens to the wind whisper through broken windows. The future of the zone remains uncertain. Climate change, economic shifts, and political instability all pose new challenges. But the lessons learned here are permanent. They are written into the soil, into the trees, into the very air, and they are carried by those who remember not only what happened, but what it meant. As the 21st century progresses, Chernobyl continues to stand as a quiet monument to the extraordinary complexities of human innovation, failure, and recovery. The zone, haunting and still, vibrant yet fragile, has become a place where the boundaries between history, ecology, and ethics blur. It is a living memory that not only commemorates what went wrong, but also challenges humanity to reflect deeply on how we steward our technology, our environment, and each other. One of the most profound and enduring impacts of Chernobyl has been on global discussions about risk, how we define it, how we measure it, and most importantly, how we communicate it. In the years before 1986, nuclear energy was largely framed in terms of promise. It was the energy of the future, limitless, clean, efficient. But Chernobyl altered the public narrative. Suddenly, the focus shifted from possibility to vulnerability. And with this shift came new standards in communication and accountability. Scientists and policymakers began to rethink how they shared information with the public. What had once been the domain of closed-door committees and classified documents now required transparency, clarity, and empathy. The realization was simple, yet revolutionary. People needed to be informed not just of technical outcomes, but of the human implications. Chernobyl also gave rise to a new field within public health and science, risk perception. Researchers began studying how people respond to invisible dangers, how they process scientific uncertainty, and how fear can shape behavior even more powerfully than facts. These insights proved invaluable, not just in the context of nuclear energy, but in areas ranging from pandemic response to climate policy. Another important legacy of Chernobyl lies in its influence on international cooperation. In a world increasingly defined by shared threats, whether radiation, viruses, or environmental collapse, Chernobyl became a case study in the necessity of collaboration across borders. After the disaster, dozens of countries contributed resources, expertise, and funding to contain the fallout, decontaminate the environment, and support those affected. These efforts laid the groundwork for stronger international frameworks. The IAEA's strengthened safety protocols, the rapid information sharing systems for nuclear incidents, and the joint monitoring programs across Europe are all, in part, a legacy of the disaster. The world learned that no country can manage a nuclear crisis alone, and that global safety depends on mutual trust and vigilance. At the same time, Chernobyl also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of centralized power and suppressed dissent. The Soviet Union's initial reluctance to share information, its punishment of whistleblowers, and its insistence on preserving state image over public safety illustrated how authoritarianism and disaster can be a deadly combination. In contrast, nations with transparent systems and free presses were shown to be better equipped to manage risk and adapt to crisis. This political dimension of Chernobyl has had a lasting impact on democratic movements within the former Soviet sphere. For many in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the disaster was not just an environmental or technological event. It was a moral rupture. It revealed the human cost of secrecy, the price of unchecked power, and it spurred, in subtle but meaningful ways, the growth of civil society, the demand for accountability, and the push toward reform. In Ukraine, especially, Chernobyl became intertwined with the national consciousness. As the country sought to assert its independence and identity following the fall of the Soviet Union, Chernobyl served as both a scar and a symbol. It was a reminder of past wounds inflicted by a foreign regime and a rallying point for national resilience and responsibility. Today, Chernobyl is often invoked in political speeches, educational programs, and cultural events as a defining moment in Ukraine's path towards sovereignty. This deep cultural connection extends even to language. In Ukrainian literature and music, Chernobyl has become a metaphor, sometimes for loss, sometimes for rebirth, sometimes for the fragile balance between nature and human ambition. It's a word that carries not just historical weight, but poetic resonance. As for the physical zone itself, it remains a place of contrasts. The new safe confinement structure stands as a marvel of engineering, its massive arch covering the shattered reactor and allowing robotic systems to begin dismantling the most dangerous debris. Yet just a few kilometers away, wild grasses and trees push through cracks in the pavement, animals patrol empty schoolyards, and the ruins of Pripyat stand untouched. This juxtaposition of high technology and slow decay, of destruction and regeneration, has captured the imagination of people worldwide. It's why Chernobyl continues to be the subject of documentaries, novels, academic studies, and digital media. The site resonates on a deeply human level. It speaks to our fears, our hopes, and our need to make sense of tragedy. And increasingly, it speaks to our future. With the global rise in energy demand and the escalating threat of climate change, the question of nuclear power has returned to the forefront. Advocates point to modern reactor designs that promise fail-safe systems and waste solutions. Critics counter with cautionary tales like Chernobyl and Fukushima. And in between, societies wrestle with the trade-offs between risk and reward, innovation and precaution. What Chernobyl teaches is not that nuclear energy is inherently evil or that progress should be feared. Rather, it teaches that our technologies are only as ethical, as safe, and as effective as the systems and cultures we build around them. It reminds us that science and engineering do not exist in a vacuum. They are entangled with politics, values, and human choices. In this sense, the story of Chernobyl is not finished. It is a continuing dialogue, a living narrative that grows with every new generation that hears its echoes. Whether in classrooms, boardrooms, or legislative chambers, the lessons of April 26, 1986 still inform the way we think about risk, responsibility, and the kind of future we want to create. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting legacy of all. Not the reactor, not the ruins, not even the zone, but the collective memory of what happened and why it must not happen again. As the sun sets over the forests and empty buildings of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the air remains still, quiet, and charged with the weight of memory. Time, in this place, feels stretched, distorted between the moment of catastrophe in 1986 and the decades of change that followed. Here, in this silent territory, the boundaries between past and present blur, offering a space to reflect not just on what happened, but on what it meant. What began as a late-night test at reactor number 4 became one of the most defining events of the modern era. It transformed how we think about energy, risk, truth, and governance. It challenged the narratives of technological invincibility and forced nations to reconsider how they prepare for and respond to disaster. Above all, it reminded the world that with great power, whether political, technological, or scientific, comes a responsibility that must never be taken lightly. The story of Chernobyl is not simply a chronicle of failure. It is a story of human bravery, sacrifice, and recovery. The firefighters who ran toward the flames with no understanding of what awaited them. The plant workers who manually drained water to prevent a second explosion. The miners who tunneled beneath the reactor to install cooling systems. The doctors, scientists, and volunteers who risked their lives to help others. It is also a story of memory. Families forced to flee in the middle of the night. Children growing up without a homeland. Villages left to decay. And yet, in the midst of that decay, a stubborn pulse of life has endured. Foxes in the streets of Pripyat, mushrooms blooming near old playgrounds, and trees growing through roofs once occupied by Soviet engineers. Memory in Chernobyl is etched into every surface. It is in the scorched walls of the reactor, in the artifacts left behind, books on desks, shoes in doorways, photos on mantles, in the personal stories passed down from those who lived there, who witnessed the sky turn pale, who watched a city evacuate, who survived, adapted, and remembered. This act of remembering is itself an act of resistance. Resistance against forgetting, against the tendency of institutions to bury the inconvenient, and against the human impulse to look away from suffering that cannot be undone. To remember Chernobyl is to stand witness to those who died, to those who lived, and to the ongoing work of those who seek to understand what happened and prevent it from happening again. Today, in an age of accelerating technological change, the lessons of Chernobyl remain more urgent than ever. As we explore new forms of energy, as artificial intelligence and automation reshape our industries, and as climate change demands bold and rapid action, the balance between ambition and caution becomes increasingly delicate. Chernobyl teaches us that when decisions are made without transparency, when warnings are ignored, and when responsibility is deferred, the cost can be immeasurable. It teaches us that the systems we build, whether physical, bureaucratic, or cultural, must be designed not only for efficiency, but for resilience, humility, and accountability. At the same time, Chernobyl also reveals our capacity to endure, to learn, to rebuild, to find meaning even in devastation. It shows that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are moments of extraordinary light, of courage, cooperation, and clarity. For the people of Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, the legacy of Chernobyl is not just historical, it is personal. It is in the laws that regulate energy, the textbooks that teach young minds, the museums that preserve truth. It is in the policies that govern safety, and in the stories passed from parents to children. It is in the very soil, the air, and the bones of the land. And for the rest of the world, it is a mirror, a reminder of what can happen when human fallibility meets complex systems, a call to vigilance, to ethical responsibility, and to compassion in the face of uncertainty. As we close this chapter and return from the quiet streets of Pripyat, from the shadow of the sarcophagus, from the fields where wild animals roam once toxic soil, we carry with us the echoes of Chernobyl, not just as a disaster, but as a monument to what we must never forget. Let it remind us to respect the power we wield, to seek truth even when it is inconvenient, and to remember that the choices we make today will shape the world for generations to come. And as you rest now, let the quiet rhythm of reflection soothe your thoughts. Let the lessons of Chernobyl, its warnings, its sorrows, its resilience, gently settle into the background of your dreams. Good night.